Welcome to folks joining via the recording. Let's share agenda. So we are moving on to our technical discussions, and the first topic is one that sort of relates to the topics of the previous two calls about typing things. So one of the issues that has come up is how to manage the potentially very large number of types of things, such as types of objects, different materials, the many languages of the world, and so on. One thing that we have not talked about as much is that also we have these statements, such as provenance statements, or material statements, where there is text, and the way that you know that the particular text is a material statement is that we have given it a type of materials. So if we go to this URI, then this isn't an identifier for materials statements, it's an identifier for materials, substances generally, or the human readable form of that data. So it's not really that this text is a material, it's more that this text is about materials, which is the idea that I thought we could discuss. So then it would mean that instead of having this is a brief text, which is true, it is a brief text, and it is a material, instead we would say it's a brief text and it's about materials. This would be a big change at this point. It would invalidate pretty much every single mapping that we've ever done. It's semantically slightly more correct. It might help with some of the management of the data, but yeah, I wanted to throw it out there. So George Brusica says, it's a nice idea, but the structure that would be most efficient would be 0.1, which is of course true, not something that we can do. This is the properties of properties problem in RDF. Which, yeah, as he says, it refers to X in the manner of blah. So it refers to this thing in the manner of materials. However, we can't do that. So instead, we don't want to do full reification with CRMPC. And the way that we have typically handled the 0.1s is with typing and not with about. So, what do people think? Is this something that is going to make it clearer or more complicated? I'm happy to close this, won't fix, interesting idea, but makes it more complicated. Happy to also continue to discuss the consequences of changing it at this point. So is that sufficient information, a sufficient introduction, or would people like more explanation?
I guess the question is, Rob, why the about property wasn't used in the first place?
Yes, indeed. So I believe, if I recall, the initial thinking was that it's the type of statement that we were talking about, and hence the type of statement is a material statement, which is pretty much what we try to say here, but this isn't a label of this particular URI. This really is materials in general rather than material statement. So it was more the notion of P2 as a classification or here is a tag, a semantically comprehensible tag, but just a tag nonetheless, associated with the resource, rather than being the subject of the content. So if there are two things that seem very similar, or it's very difficult to explain the distinction between them, then the pattern has been to use the simpler of the forms. So if there were statements that really weren't about something, they really were a credit line. Right? There was a concept specifically for credit lines. So it's not about credit lines, it's about, I guess, acknowledgements, acknowledging participation. So in that case, we would not want to use classified as credit line. We would say it's about acknowledging, but that's a little bit more unfamiliar to folks. So that was, I think that was the initial thinking about just throwing everything into P2 has type. If that helps.
Is the suggestion to move a lot of that into about? Because I'm a bit confused about the example with acknowledgement. It seems to me that the object could still be of type acknowledgement because it's a type. It's not really about. I mean, one could say the acknowledgement is about persons actually.
Yes, quite. Yeah, and that was, I think, some of the rationale for using classified as in the first place, and just being very loose with what the classifications are. But if we're loose with what the classifications are, e.g., this statement is a material or has type material, then we need to then be clearer with our lists of types as to what. If you find a statement that is classified as materials, then that is a material statement, which we've punted on to some extent in the previous calls. So this was in that line of thinking, and hence me putting it on the agenda for now. Move on to other topics.
Can't we just be flexible about this? I mean, anyway, it sounds like the sort of type versus subject that's plaguing our domain as a whole forever, and that just depends on perspective. So probably the smarter thing that we can do is not to try to enforce a solution for every possible object.
Yeah. Or so I think we should have guidance. However, there should be something for consumers to consume with some reliability. That how does a consumer find the material statement in this case in the data? Should they be looking in classified as, or should they be looking in about? I think we need to at least pick one.
Can I mean, I haven't got the documentation in front of me, but my understanding is that P2 is meant to be a sort of an easy way to extend the CRM hierarchies. So in my mind, P2 has always been a stricter association. So really what goes under P2 should be an ISA. So if we follow that principle, then it's clearly wrong to say that a statement is a material.
Yeah.
So I think, although I tend to sort of prefer more complex structures, but I think in that case it would actually be quite important to be correct and change that to about.
Yeah, I agree, and to a great extent, I would add that. I would add that to a great extent, it depends on the concept that's being used. I mean, if the get vocabulary at the concept of a material statement, then it would be fit as a type. The thing is that if we are using the concept of material, which is quite a different beast, then using it as a type for something that's not a material would be an ontological misclassification. So in a way,
Exactly.
the concept itself gives us the solution whether it should be type or about. Sorry, classified or about.
Yep.
And probably we could come with some guidelines using that that line of thought.
Mm-hmm. And we can certainly catalog the types of statements that we know are common, and ask Patricia in the vocabularies to create specific types for them. And that would solve the semantic issue for sure.
Yeah, that would, yes. I don't think there's a problem with that.
And yeah, I put the documentation for his type up, and indeed, you know, entities, and there is a hierarchy, maybe blah blah blah. You know, it's reasonably. We've been somewhat loose with when we use his type, just to avoid minting many different entities in AAT. But yeah, it's, you know, it's been focusing on the use of thesaurus as opposed to this is a form of subclassing. I realize it's coming very close to the top of the hour. Any other thoughts on this? Or otherwise, I'll take an action to talk to Patricia about whether we can get a bunch of statement types into AAT. No other considerations? And as well, then, is the preference of the group then to stick with classified as and instead use more specific thesaurus terms rather than going to about and using the existing more general terms?
I mean, perhaps one consideration would be to look at the hierarchy of the P68 that George is recommending and see which properties we're excluding by just switching to type and not using the P68. But maybe there's no time to do that now.
Yep, that's a good idea.
I think we'll need the about anyway. I mean, whatever refinement we add for types in AT or another vocabulary, there will always be someone needing a subject that would add a shade of meaning to the type.
Yeah, yes, agreed. Right, well, it is top of the hour. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you in particular to Johannes for joining. Hope that this was interesting and enlightening.
Thank you very much.
Please do feel free to continue to join if that would be helpful. And otherwise, we also hopefully will see you in London in October.
Yes, sounds good.
Great, and thank you to Jonathan for John for the lovely notes. And we'll have a call again in another couple of weeks. All right, thank you, everyone.